It was an afternoon under a lead-colored sky, the kind of sky that holds its breath before the rain, as if even time hesitates before what's about to unfold. Beatriz walked hurriedly along the stone-paved sidewalks of the city's bohemian quarter, her steps carrying the urgency of someone who dreams of not being late, but fears they'll never truly arrive. She clutched her canvases the way one holds sleeping children, with care, reverence, and a love no one else could see, but which she knew lived there. Inside the small gallery, scented with fresh paint, a group exhibition of young artists was just minutes from starting. It was the chance she had waited for, maybe for months, maybe for years, maybe for a whole life that had always been told it wasn't enough. When Bernardo walked into that place, he didn't seem to know where to look. Tall, dressed in a dark suit, with the expression of someone who already had everything, and because of that, no longer searched for anything. But then he saw her, not as a collector sees a painting, but as a man sees, for the first time, someone who changes the temperature of the air. Their eyes met, and in that moment, no color on the wall was stronger than the red rising in her cheeks. He moved closer, as if unaware he was being drawn, and she smiled with her eyes, not because she wanted to seem kind, but because she didn't know how to protect herself. "Is this one yours?" he asked, pointing to a painting of a woman with her back turned, gazing at the sea. She nodded with a reserved gesture. "There's longing in that brushstroke," he said. Beatriz didn't reply. She didn't know how to answer a man who could see inside. All she knew was that it was dangerous, that no one from her world had the right to be that close to her feelings. And still, she didn't pull away. The mother-in-law arrived 20 minutes later, not entering the gallery, but rather invading it, with the authority of someone who always belongs. Impeccable. Subtle jewelry and posture so upright it seemed the world turned just to watch her pass. Her name was Clarice, and when Clarice's eyes landed on Beatriz, there were no words, only a delicate smile, made of silence and judgment. The kind of smile that says nothing but insinuates everything. Clarice extended her hand, cold and light like porcelain. Beatriz shook it respectfully, but felt the chill creep up her arm. In that brief touch, she understood what Clarice would never say out loud. "You do not belong in this world." Bernardo, still blind to the unspoken tension, spoke enthusiastically about the paintings, about how special the place felt. But Clarice only watched. She observed Beatriz's every movement with the precision of a collector assessing a piece unworthy of her collection. And when she finally said in a soft voice, "Very interesting. Your style. Reminds me of something I once saw in Paris, though. Less refined." Beatriz knew. That wasn't praise. It was a warning in disguise. But that night, even under frozen gazes, something bloomed. Bernardo asked for her number as someone who's gently asking permission to enter another person's life, and Beatriz gave it. With fear, with shame, with a heart pounding so loud it drowned out the world. But she gave it, because something inside her, a spark buried under years of ash, whispered that maybe, just maybe, she could be loved by someone who had never seen her as less. What Beatriz couldn't know, what no one could have warned her about, was that this love, so pure at its birth, would have to survive an invisible battlefield. And the fiercest enemy wouldn't come from the outside. It would live inside the house, inside the family, inside a heart unwilling to let go of control. First impressions never fade, and Clarice had already made up her mind. That girl would never be good enough. She woke up early, while the sky was still painted in blue-gray tones, the alarm buzzing quietly on the corner of her old nightstand next to the narrow bed. Beatriz's room was small, but it was entirely hers. Magazine clippings pasted on the wall, paintbrushes tucked into glass cups, and stains of color that had reached even her sheets. She didn't have much, but everything she owned had a story, sweat, struggle. Across the city, Bernardo's reality began in silence. The windows of his penthouse apartment opened automatically to sunlight filtered through French curtains. The bathtub was already filled at the perfect temperature, and the coffee was served by trained hands that knew his preferences before he even said a word. They were two different worlds, two different breaths, two different rhythms of life that were never meant to intersect. But love, when it arrives, doesn't ask permission from logic. Beatriz walked out with her canvases under her arm, balancing her dreams in a crowded public bus, while Bernardo was silently driven in an armored car to meetings where numbers danced on marble tables. She painted because she needed to breathe. He managed companies because he had been taught that the world was business, and that the heart was a risk to be avoided. But ever since he met her, Something inside him had begun to crumble. It wasn't sudden passion. It was a quiet unrest, as if life had been too organized, too predictable, and therefore profoundly empty. Clarice noticed it with growing discomfort. It wasn't just a mother's jealousy. It was something deeper, a belief, almost religious, that love is only valid when it follows rules, when it strengthens empires, when it protects the bloodline. To her, feelings didn't sustain families. Alliances did. Names, fortunes, carefully arranged marriages with the right people, with the right last names. Beatriz was none of that. She was color, instinct, silence painted in canvases no one else understood. Clarice couldn't bear the idea of seeing her son tangled with someone not carved from the same marble. The dinner between families never happened. Clarice found it unnecessary. She preferred to keep everything at a distance, controlling it with subtle gestures. But Bernardo insisted on taking Beatriz to events, exhibitions, fancy cafes in neighborhoods she had only seen in photos. And she, with an almost invisible effort, tried to fit in, learning wine names, practicing accents, searching the mirror for some elegance that could mask her insecurity. Yet, in every luxurious room, she felt the stares, not only Clarice's, but from an entire world that silently whispered, "You don't belong." Still, Bernardo didn't see any of it. To him, she was light amid the polish. She was truth among the masks. He saw beauty in her paint-stained hands that no one from his bubble could ever understand. And more he drifted from the world that once protected him, but now suffocated him. He began to dream of a different life, simpler, freer, more alive, with her. But Beatriz felt the pressure mounting, and though she tried not to show it, she painted with growing anguish. Her artworks darkened, her strokes became anxious. It was no longer art, it was catharsis. And in the solitude of her improvised studio, she cried without sound, because she knew no matter how real their love was, she was the unlikely part of the equation. And in stories like this, the unlikely part is always the one that bleeds the most. Bernardo began to talk about marriage. She deflected. He made plans. She stepped back, not because she didn't want it, but because, deep down, she already sensed that loving someone from another world also meant facing that world. And she still didn't know if she was strong enough for it, nor did she imagine what that world was capable of doing to push her away. The message came from Bernardo, wrapped in casual tone but heavy with tension. "My mother's hosting a small dinner this weekend. I'd really love for you to come." He said it like someone trying to sound carefree, but his eyes betrayed the childish fear of hearing a no. Beatriz smiled, hesitant. Inside, something tightened. She knew that invitation wasn't just a gesture of courtesy. It was a minefield, a silent test. Clarice wasn't the kind of woman who opened her home to just anyone. And if she was opening it now, it wasn't to welcome. It was to measure, to observe, to judge. In the following days, Beatriz could barely paint. She spent hours in front of the mirror trying to decide what to wear. Nothing felt right. The dresses she owned felt too simple, too informal, too wrong. In the end, she chose the most neutral one. A dark blue dress with no brand, but with a story. A dress she had bought with the money from her first sale. It was what she had. And maybe it was better to just be herself, even if that put her at a disadvantage. Deep down, she carried the hope that love would be enough. That authenticity would be enough. She didn't know yet that for certain people, nothing ever is. The Ferraz A. Almeida mansion stood in a silent neighborhood, where even the trees looked sculpted. When Bernardo's car stopped in front of the iron gate, Beatriz swallowed hard. It felt like stepping into another planet. Everything exuded power. From the ivy-trimmed facade to the perfect symmetry of the columns. Bernardo squeezed her hand tightly. "Everything's going to be fine," he said. She smiled, but her heart beat like it didn't believe him. Clarice greeted them at the door with a smile too elegant to be sincere. A kiss on the cheek, a veiled compliment. "How darling your dress is," and a glance that scanned Beatriz from head to toe as if evaluating a piece that didn't belong in the collection. The living room was large, lit by an antique chandelier, with furniture that looked untouched by time. A couple of family friends were present, a distant cousin, and, of course, Livia, the discreet heiress Clarice kept nearby like an ace up her sleeve. Beautiful, well-mannered, dressed with surgical precision. She greeted Beatrice with rehearsed kindness, but her eyes told a different story. During dinner, Beatrice tried to smile, to participate, to talk about her art. But the conversation always circled back to topics she didn't know: international finance, investment portfolios, ski trips. When she mentioned an exhibit she had joined in a community cultural center, Clarice commented with sweet venom, "These social projects have symbolic value. It's lovely to see young people dedicating themselves, even with such limited resources." Beatriz swallowed hard. It felt like being praised for swimming in a puddle, in front of people born on yachts. Bernardo noticed. He tried to deflect, change subjects, shield her. But even he had limits. The evening went on with expensive dishes, wines Beatriz couldn't name, and smiles that hurt more than cruel words. As she said goodbye to Clarice, the woman held her gaze a second too long and said, "It was a pleasure having you. I hope you'll feel comfortable returning, if this life is truly what you're looking for." The phrase hung in the air, polite, dangerous, and meticulously calculated. In the car, on the way home, Beatriz stared out the window in silence. Bernardo reached for her hand. "I'm sorry for all of it. She'll change. She'll understand. She just needs time." Beatriz nodded with a fragile smile, but inside, a voice whispered, "This wasn't an invitation. It was a warning." And she knew the real dinner was still to come, the one where she'd be served as the main course at the banquet of contempt. The silence in Beatriz's studio was different after that dinner. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of unrest, an echo of unspoken words, of looks that cut deeper than shouts, of smiles that hid blades. She tried to paint, but her strokes came out shaky. The once vibrant colors now weighed on her brush, as if burdened by centuries of exhaustion. Every new canvas became a battlefield between what she felt and what she needed to pretend not to feel. Bernardo was still there, still in love, but even in the sweetest kisses there was a taste of urgency, as if both of them knew, without saying it, that they were living something that could collapse at any moment. He came to see her often, almost daily, escaping the routine of meetings and the coldness of his penthouse walls. In Beatriz's home, where the floor creaked and street noise slipped through the windows, Bernardo felt more alive than he ever had in any marble hall. He would sit on the floor, watching her paint in silence, listening to her stories, playing with the frayed threads of paint on her apron, and he'd say, with eyes lit up, "You're the most real woman I've ever met." She smiled, but inside the phrase echoed like a warning. Real? Yes. But was being real ever enough? One day, as she was finishing an unfinished portrait, he came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her gently, and whispered, "I want you to paint a portrait of me." She laughed shyly, but he insisted. "I want to see how you see me. I want to see myself through your eyes." She agreed, not with lightness, but with fear, because painting someone is to cross them with your soul. And Beatriz knew that putting Bernardo on canvas would expose everything she felt, including what she hadn't dared admit even to herself. In the days that followed, she painted him in silence. She studied his face with care, his eyes, his firm jaw, the curve of his lips. But it was in his gaze that she dove deepest. She painted what no one else saw, the doubt behind his confidence, the tenderness hidden beneath the heir's armor, the loneliness of someone raised to be strong, but who longed to be loved without conditions. When she finished, she showed him with trembling hands. Bernardo stared at it in silence for a long time. Then he said, voice thick with emotion, "I've never seen myself like this before." And then he kissed her. Not a hurried kiss, not a gesture of desire. It was a slow kiss, full of questions and promises, as if saying, "If I'm going to fall, let it be with you." That night, they made love with the tenderness of those who know everything can be taken away at any moment. Like two shipwrecked souls meeting on a lifeboat in the middle of a storm. There was no hurry, no guarantees, only presence, body, soul, skin, and fear. The deepest secret, however, wasn't in what they shared, but in what they were hiding. Bernardo had begun pulling away from the family business, avoiding meetings, turning down offers. He was thinking of investing in something smaller, something of his own, something Beatriz could be part of, but he hadn't said anything yet. He didn't want her to feel responsible. He wanted to surprise her, offer her freedom. What he didn't know was that Clarice was already beginning to suspect, and the quiet steps he was taking toward Beatriz echoed like thunder through the frozen halls of the mansion. Meanwhile, Beatriz had her own secret. She had begun receiving invitations to bigger exhibitions. Her name was circulating among curators quietly, but she declined. She hesitated. She delayed. because deep down she was afraid of growing and losing. Afraid that if she shone too brightly, Clarice's world would crush her harder. And above all, afraid that Bernardo would feel torn between two loves, the woman he chose and the mother who raised him. But secrets, even the best-kept ones, eventually come to light. And what lay ahead was no longer a choice between love and pride. It was the beginning of a dangerous game where every gesture would count, and where Clarice, patient as a black widow, was already spinning the first threads of a trap that would turn passion into trial. It all started with a phone call that never came. A major art grant, one Beatriz had anxiously awaited for months, had been quietly announced, and she hadn't even been notified. The project that could have opened real doors in her career, one that brought together the most promising names in the city's contemporary art scene, happened without her. When she found out, days later, it was already too late. The list of selected artists had been published, the event announced, the invitations sent. Beatriz just stood there, phone in hand, feeling the ground slip away beneath her feet, as if she were falling in slow motion. It felt like the world had moved on without her, like someone had erased her existence with an invisible eraser. At first, she thought it was a mistake, maybe an email issue, a communication glitch. But as she asked around, all she got were awkward silences. People dodging questions, avoiding eye contact, saying, "I'm not really sure what happened," until an old professor, voice lowered, revealed what many knew but no one dared to say out loud. There had been interference from the top, very top. Beatriz didn't want to believe it. She couldn't. But deep down, in that shadowed corner of her chest, she already knew. She felt it. Clarice. The pain wasn't just about the lost opportunity. It was the realization that she was being hunted, that someone was quietly moving pieces behind the curtain to knock her down without ever laying a finger on her. Clarice didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She didn't accuse. She simply pulled the invisible threads of the world she ruled. Beatriz felt small, fragile, alone, and for a moment, she thought about giving up, not on love, but on everything that came with it, because the price was starting to feel far too high. When Bernardo arrived that evening, arms full of grocery bags, smiling, saying he'd brought wine and ingredients to make a special dinner, Beatriz couldn't keep up the facade. She sat on the studio floor, surrounded by unfinished canvases, and cried. Cried with her whole chest, unable to explain, not wanting to dramatize, but unable to hide. Bernardo knelt beside her, desperate to understand. She told him everything, or almost everything. Said she had lost the opportunity to exhibit, that something felt off, that maybe someone had interfered, but she didn't name names. He looked at her with tenderness, but also with that disbelief so common in people who still want to believe the world isn't that cruel. He said maybe it was just a coincidence, that they could look into it, that he had connections and could help. She smiled sadly. She knew he wanted to help, but she also knew he still didn't see how far Clarice was willing to go. He still saw her as a difficult, demanding mother, not as someone capable of manipulating another woman's fate just to stay in control. That night, they cooked dinner anyway. A simple sauce, cheap wine, soft music on the old radio. They laughed a little, faked lightness. But the silence between sentences said everything. Love was still standing, but it was surrounded. And each day, Clarice tightened the invisible knots that kept their worlds apart. She didn't yell, she didn't strike, but she did what she did best. She erased people, with elegance. And now, Beatriz was the target of a cold war in which love was the only trench, and hearts, the only soldiers. But the worst was still ahead, because the sabotage of the grant was only the first piece on the board. Clarice had time, resources, and a plan, and the next move wouldn't just hurt. It would destroy, elegantly, quietly, with cruelty disguised as fate. And when the trap finally revealed itself, Beatriz would understand. Loving a man like Bernardo wasn't just an act of courage. It was a leap into the dark, with open eyes and an exposed heart. She had always been there, even before Beatriz came into the picture. Not in the shadows, but in the background, as if her presence were part of a grand plan never fully revealed. Livia Castañeras, granddaughter of diplomats, daughter of powerful entrepreneurs, heiress to a fortune with a last name that opened doors even in silence. Tall, elegant, educated in Swiss boarding schools, with a refined mastery of etiquette and discreet seduction. She wasn't a soap opera villain. She was worse. She was the kind of woman who never needed to prove she belonged. The world had already been prepared to receive her. Clarice always kept her close, at dinners, charity events, social gatherings. She never said, out loud, that she wanted her as a daughter-in-law. But everyone knew, Livia included. While Beatriz struggled to rise from the ruins of silent sabotage, Clarice moved with the precision of a strategist. She began inviting Bernardo to family lunches, insisting he attend charity galas, reminding him with a gentle smile that appearances must be maintained. And in every one of those places, Livia was there, always poised, always kind, always offering her arm, her smile, her subtle compliments. Bernardo resisted. He said he wasn't interested, that his life was on a different path now. But Clarice just smiled, the way someone does when they say, "Time will take care of it." Beatriz heard of Livia through an offhand comment from a mutual friend. At first, she tried to brush it off. But then, the photos began appearing on social media. Images of Bernardo beside Livia at public events, always composed, always formal, but always present. Clarice made sure they were seen, as if shouting without a word, "She is where he belongs." Beatrice looked at the images in silence, her face lit by the phone's screen on sleepless nights. There were no kisses, no embraces, but it was enough to wound. She didn't ask Bernardo about it, didn't demand answers, didn't raise her voice. She simply sank into silence. And in that silence, the pain took root. Her paintings began to change. The colors grew colder. The eyes in her portraits carried sorrow. Her hands trembled more. And deep inside, a strange feeling crept in, that she was only a phase, a poetic pause between who he had been and who everyone expected him to become again. Bernardo noticed the distance, but didn't know how to cross it. He said he loved her, that those appearances with Livia were his mother's demands, that he did it all out of respect for family pressure. But Beatriz, without meaning to, began to doubt. Because it's not just about what one says, it's about what one allows. And by allowing Clarice to script a parallel narrative, Bernardo left the door open for a cruel storyline in which Beatriz was once again the outsider, the stranger, the temporary one. Livia, for her part, was flawless. She never attacked, never implied. She was friendly, understanding, intelligent. She knew exactly when to stay quiet, when to laugh, when to lightly touch Bernardo's arm during a conversation. She wasn't competing. She was simply present. Present enough to occupy the space Beatriz was beginning, unintentionally, to leave behind. And Clarice watched everything from a distance, like someone observing a play whose scenes she already knew by heart. She waited for the collapse. She knew Beatriz's love was real, and precisely for that reason, fragile when faced with the structure of the world she controlled. Beatriz was talent, sensitivity, courage, but Livia was certainty, protocol, the continuation of legacy. The stage was set, the triangle drawn, and just when Beatriz thought she had already felt the worst pain, Clarice prepared the next blow, one that wouldn't just threaten love, but aimed to destroy her dignity. Because to the aristocratic mother-in-law, her son's love was a threat, and Beatriz, a mistake to be corrected, not with anger, but with strategy, like a mother who corrects her son's path, to protect him from a life she doesn't deem worthy. Nothing Clarice did was impulsive. Everything was calculated, silence and timing. When she realized that Livia's presence wasn't producing the effect she expected, that despite forced appearances and public events, Bernardo still returned to Beatriz with the same tenderness, she decided to cross the line of what was acceptable. Because for a woman like Clarice, losing control of her son was more painful than any scandal. She couldn't accept that a girl without a last name, without fortune, without noble background, could threaten the legacy she had spent her entire life crafting. And so, with the serenity of someone who never hesitates, Clarice set the trap. She hired a man, young, handsome, seductive, a model known in the art scene, with rehearsed charm, predator eyes, and a smile that knew how to hide behind compliments. The plan was simple: infiltrate Beatriz's world, present himself as an admirer, a colleague, maybe even a friend, and slowly spark a connection that felt natural. She didn't need Beatriz to give in, just for it to appear so. Just one image, one moment taken out of context, enough to flip the emotional game. Beatriz met him at an art workshop hosted by a small gallery that had recently shown interest in her work. The man introduced himself as Raphael, gentle, complimentary of her technique, genuinely interested in her canvases. He was witty, sensitive, said things like, You paint what words can't express. And Beatriz, still wounded by Bernardo's absences and the veiled humiliations of a world she was trying to fit into, allowed a small space for conversation. Not out of interest, but out of exhaustion. The human need to be seen without being measured. Raphael never pushed. He knew exactly when to smile, when to step back, when to reappear. In the following days, he started showing up in unexpected places. At the cafe near her studio, at a colleague's exhibit, on social media, always kind, always attentive. And Beatriz, though cautious, sensed something different, or at the very least, someone who saw her not as a threat, but as an artist. And that, by itself, was a relief. A dangerous relief. On a gray afternoon, while Bernardo was away on a business trip, Raphael showed up at the studio with flowers and an invitation to a new exhibit. He said he admired her work, said she deserved more than what she was living, said someone like her shouldn't be kept in the shadows. And as he left, he kissed her hand. A small gesture, old-fashioned, but loaded with insinuation. Beatriz pulled back, surprised, but she said nothing. And without knowing, she gave the trap exactly what it needed. A hesitation. Across the city, Clarice already had what she wanted. Raphael wasn't working alone. A photographer, discreet, paid to remain invisible, had documented everything. Every meeting, every glance, every movement. And that afternoon, he captured the exact moment of the hand kiss. The perfect angle, the confused expression, the closeness of their faces. No real kiss, no betrayal. But for those who want to believe what they fear, the image said it all. The photo was sent to Bernardo days later. No sender, just a short message. She deserves your respect. See with your own eyes. When he opened the file, Bernardo felt the ground vanish. His throat tightened, and for a moment, doubt gnawed at love, because the image said more than Beatriz ever would. And even though reason screamed, his heart went silent. But something was different in him now. A shadow of maturity, a flicker of suspicion, not toward Beatriz, but toward everything around them, toward Clarice, toward her perfect truths. And in that instant, even without yet knowing the truth behind the image, Bernardo felt something was wrong, deeply wrong, and that perhaps behind that kiss on the hand was another hand, larger, invisible, pulling all the strings. Love was about to be tested, not by words, but by traps. And Beatriz, who had always painted her feelings with sincere colors, was now accused of a portrait she didn't create, but one everyone seemed eager to believe. The photo file stayed open on Bernardo's phone for hours. He zoomed in, zoomed out, looked again. He tried, in vain, to find a different narrative for what his eyes were seeing, but his heart resisted the verdict. He knew Beatriz. He knew her gestures, her silences, her hesitations, and that expression on her face. It wasn't guilt. It was surprise. It was discomfort. But something was there, something curling around his feelings like a weed, the ghost of doubt. And doubt, once it enters love, doesn't need evidence. Just one skewed glance is enough to poison what was once pure. Bernardo didn't call her that day, nor the next. He kept his distance, as if silence might buy him time to sort through what he felt. Beatriz noticed. She felt the space widening without knowing why. And it was in that gap, that void of messages, of embraces, of presence, that the cracks began to bleed. When he finally appeared at the studio, there was no tenderness on his face, no anger, just a cold, suffocated look, the kind of gaze that longs for answers but dreads the truth. He showed her the image without saying a word. Beatriz, upon seeing it, turned pale. The world spun. Her hands trembled. The floor vanished beneath her, as if she had fallen into an invisible trap. She tried to explain, but the words came out broken. She said nothing happened, that he was just an acquaintance, that it was a misunderstood gesture. But Bernardo didn't yell, and that hurt more, because his silence was the absence of trust. As if, deep inside, he was erasing every memory they had, every true moment, every touch. "You let him?" he asked, his voice low. A simple question, yet full of layers. She wanted to say no, that the kiss never happened, that it was all unexpected. But in that moment, no word was enough, because the image had already won, because Clarice didn't need a kiss. She only needed a doubt, and that doubt had already taken root. Beatriz stepped back. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She just cried, silently. Bernardo left without goodbye. And in that moment, in the heart of a woman who had always fought the invisible, a bitter certainty was born. That everything they had built could fall apart because of something that never happened. In the days that followed, the world grew colder. Clarice said nothing to her son. She merely watched the silence between them expand like a comfortable fog. Livia reappeared, with the same gentle smile, the same careful gestures, as if it were just coincidence. And Bernardo, emotionally exhausted, let himself be carried by a kind of social anesthesia, the apathy that comes after love is wounded. He went out, smiled for photos, showed up at events, but inside, everything was noise. Beatriz drowned in art. She painted without stopping. She painted pain, rejection, anguish. Her work began to attract attention, not for technique, but for the raw truth that leapt off the canvas. Silent screams that poured from the paint like open wounds. People were moved. They wanted to know who was the artist painting with such soul. But she was no longer there. Only her emptiness remained. And then, something unexpected happened. A respected curator visited her studio and offered her a spot in an exhibition in another state. A real invitation. Clean. No interference. No sabotage. It was the chance she had always waited for. And paradoxically, it hurt the most. Because her greatest triumph would come just as love was falling apart. She didn't hesitate. She accepted. Not to run away, but because she needed to remember who she was before it all. Before the traps. Before the rejection. Before loving someone who, even while loving her back, had allowed the venom of doubt to divide them. And on the bus that carried her far from it all, Beatriz cried in silence. Not because she had lost Bernardo, but because deep down, she still loved him with everything she had, even knowing that, in that moment, he chose to believe in a kiss that never happened. There was no letter, no dramatic farewell. Beatriz simply closed the door to her studio, picked up her canvases, and left. The exhibition in another city was what any artist her age would call a fresh start. But to her, it felt more like an ending, a voluntary exile, a kind of escape that didn't smell of freedom, but of mourning. Because leaving the place where you loved, where you dreamed, where you believed you could belong, hurts more than losing. It's like abandoning a part of yourself and carrying only what's left, and what remains of a broken heart is never light. The bus moved along the highway in silence. Her head rested against the window, her hands clutching a backpack holding her sketches, and one photo of him, the only one she didn't have the courage to throw away. The landscapes passed quickly outside, but inside, everything felt frozen. She couldn't cry. She couldn't sleep. She could only feel, a feeling without a name, a mix of loss, guilt, longing, disillusionment, and a love that, even crushed, still insisted on breathing. The city that welcomed her was smaller, simpler, more human. The gallery was modest, but there was warmth. The owners embraced her like people who recognized true talent, without titles, without surnames, without a curated backstory. For the first time in a long time, Beatriz felt seen for who she was, not for who people expected her to be. But that wasn't enough to heal. She painted during the day, slept poorly at night, and in the early hours, when the blue light of her phone tempted her, she would scroll through social media and search for Bernardo. Always silently, always without liking, without commenting, without touching, just watching. And each time, more photos of him with Livia would appear. At dinners, at events, on outings, always with practiced smiles, always with that lost look in his eyes. Bernardo, meanwhile, was no longer whole. Beatriz's absence was like an invisible fever. It didn't hurt constantly, but when it hit, it burned from within. He remembered the smell of her studio, the way she wrinkled her nose when concentrating, the way she brought him back to reality with a simple touch on his fingers. But the image, that cursed image, still hovered between them, not because he believed in it completely, but because he felt betrayed by the universe, as if fate were mocking his naivety, as if loving a woman like Beatriz had been a mistake he was meant to pay for. Clarice, seeing her son more composed, more obedient, more present at her events, thought she had won. And in some ways, she had. But Bernardo's eyes had changed. They no longer sparkled. His light was out. And Clarice, who had always fed on order, began to sense that the cost of victory had been too high. Because her son, though still physically there, no longer belonged to anything. Time passed. 1 month, 2, 3. and Beatriz began to rebuild herself, inch by inch. Her exhibition was an unexpected success. The paintings sold. Critics praised. A local newspaper even compared her to rising international artists. But all of it reached her like a distant echo, because fame without love is applause in an empty theater. It doesn't fill you. She smiled in interviews, thanked people politely, but inside, she remained shattered. And then, on a gray afternoon, Bernardo received an unexpected phone call, a hidden number. A deep, calm male voice said only, "The truth deserves to be seen, even if it arrives late." And the link that followed showed everything. Raphael, the charming model, in another city, talking with a friend at a cafe. He didn't know he was being filmed. He bragged, laughing, about the money he had made, hitting on the artist of the moment. He mentioned Clarice by name, described the plan, spoke with disdain, as if he didn't see people, only roles in a dirty game. Bernardo watched the video in silence. Once, then again, a third time, until the tears came. Not tears of pain, but of shame, of guilt, of regret. Because now he understood everything he had allowed to happen, and he realized that the woman he loved had been wounded not just by Clarice, but by him, for not defending her, for hesitating, for doubting, for letting love die silently, drowned by a lie. So, he stood up. He didn't say a word to his mother, didn't explain. He just left. Because sometimes, love alone isn't enough. You need courage to face it. And he knew that to find Beatriz again, he would have to cross not just cities, but the abyss he himself had carved between them. The hallway of the mansion was silent, as if the walls themselves sensed the coming storm. Bernardo entered without announcement. He was no longer the obedient son, the tamed heir, the young man who shrank before his mother's veiled authority. His eyes were steady, his face expressionless, his steps resolute. Clarice watched from the veranda, a glass of wine between her fingers, and when she saw him approach without ceremony, she knew. There was something she no longer controlled. Still, she held her composure, because women like her are trained never to falter, even when the truth approaches like a blade. "You destroyed the only real thing I ever had." The words came dry, firm, direct. Clarice didn't answer immediately. She placed the glass down gently on the table, looked at her son with eyes that longed to maintain elegance, but deep down, carried wounded pride. "I protected you, Bernardo. I did what was necessary to keep you in your rightful place. By lying? By bribing? By manipulating my life like it was a board game?" His voice oscillated between anger and disappointment. He didn't shout, but each sentence cut deep, and for the first time, Clarice felt something she rarely did. Discomfort. Not from the world's judgment, but from her son's gaze that no longer recognized her. He tossed his phone onto the table. The video of Raphael played, the audio clear, words of contempt, living proof of a silent betrayal. Clarice didn't look away. She watched it all, without blinking. When it ended, she let out a long sigh, like someone drained of pretending. "And if I did it, it was because I was afraid of losing you. You never understood what it means to build a family, a name, a legacy. Everything we have, Bernardo, didn't come from nothing. And that girl could have ruined it all. She never wanted to ruin anything. She just wanted to love. But you chose to humiliate her, to erase her every step as if she were a mistake. And me, I let you." His voice cracked then. Emotion caught up with him, no longer as a son, but as a man, as someone who realized he failed the one who deserved protection. Clarice tried to approach, tried to touch his arm, but he pulled back. "You made me believe it was love. But what you feel, mother, that's not love. It's possession. It's fear of losing control. And if keeping this empire means destroying people, then maybe I don't want any of it." It was like a silent bomb had gone off. Clarice, for a moment, lost her poise. She sat slowly, her face blank, her hands trembling. "Are you going to leave her?" she asked softly. "No. She left me, and maybe I deserve that. But I'm still going to fight. Because for the first time, I understand what it means to love someone truly, without trying to reshape them, without trying to change them. Just love." Clarice didn't answer. She stayed there, staring into nothing. Bernardo turned, walked toward the door. But before leaving, he looked back one last time. "If you ever want to see me again, you'll have to accept that I'm not the same, that the world doesn't revolve around your fear. It turns on what we choose to build, even if it's flawed." even if it's imperfect love. And he left. Clarice remained. For the first time, not as a matriarch, but as a woman, alone, surrounded by an empire she had built, but where no one wanted to live anymore. And maybe, deep down, she knew she hadn't just lost a battle. She had lost her son. She had lost herself, and she didn't yet know if she had the strength to rebuild. But far from there, life had begun to move again. And Bernardo, heart shattered, headed toward a distant city, carrying with him only one painting, the self-portrait Beatriz had painted of him, the only place where he could still see himself whole, where, despite everything, he was still loved, truly. The city was smaller than he remembered, or maybe it was time that had changed his perception, reducing everything to what truly matters. Bernardo arrived at dusk, unannounced, his coat still dusty from the road and his heart heavy, as if he were carrying the wreckage of his own past on his shoulders. He walked through the narrow streets until he found the old building Beatriz had mentioned in her voice notes, the one that smelled of damp wood and had plaster walls stained with leaks no one bothered to fix. He stopped at the door and hesitated. For the first time, the man who had learned to run companies, lead negotiations, and inherit fortunes, felt small in front of a doorbell. Beatriz wasn't home. The neighbor from the second floor, an elderly lady with white hair and a soft voice, recognized him from the pictures. She said Beatriz was at a group exhibition at the cultural center, just 3 blocks down the street. Bernardo thanked her, but couldn't say anything else. His hands were shaking, his heart racing. There was something sacred in that moment, something that reminded him of those early days when he first saw her and somehow knew his life would never be the same. When he arrived at the gallery, people were standing silently before the canvases. It was a simple space, almost improvised, but it had soul, it had pain. Every painting screamed at those who passed by. Dark tones, twisted shapes, eyes that didn't look at anyone, but pierced through everything. He recognized the strokes, the colors, the unspoken truths. It was Beatriz, whole, shattered, alive. And there, in the center of the room, she was. She stood with her back turned, talking to a couple of visitors. Her hair was hastily tied up, her blouse stained with paint, her fingers dirty, as always. But there was something new in her, a weight on her shoulders, a fortress in her eyes. She turned when she heard her name. Bernardo. Time stopped. Her eyes widened for a moment, then filled with tears. But she didn't move, neither did he. They stood there, among people who had no idea what they were witnessing. He took a step, then another, until he was standing before her. He said nothing at first, just looked at her, as if begging for forgiveness with his eyes, as if no longer expecting to be loved, but needing, just once, to be understood. I saw everything. The words came low, hoarse. I know what they did to you. I know what I allowed. I know what I lost. And I didn't come here to ask you to come back. I just needed to look at you one more time, knowing that this time, I truly saw you. Beatrice lowered her eyes. Tears fell silently, and when she looked at him again, there was pain, but also something he hadn't expected. Love, still there, intact, wounded, but alive. She didn't hug him, didn't run into his arms like in the movies. She just held his hand and said, "It's not about going back, it's about moving forward. I fought so hard for us that I lost parts of myself along the way. I need to relearn who I am before I decide where I'm going. But thank you for coming, for looking into my eyes, for not running away." They stayed there for minutes that felt like years. 2 hearts that no longer knew how to live as before, but refused to end the story. He smiled with sadness. "If one day you want, I'll be wherever you are, waiting." And then, like someone who doesn't want to ruin the small bit of healing that bloomed there, he said goodbye. Not with a farewell, but with a "whenever you're ready." He left slowly, without looking back, and Beatrice remained. But something had changed. For the first time, she felt the pain had been seen, that the love, though wounded, was no longer hostage to lies, and that, maybe, just maybe, there was a future. Not like before, but better, freer, more just. The reunion brought no resolution, no promises. It brought silence, but a new kind of silence. Lighter, less suffocating. Beatrice returned home with a confused heart, her face still damp, and the feeling that the man who loved her finally saw her. But what to do with that gaze? What to do with all that still hurt, even after the apology? Love isn't a reset button. Wanting to return isn't enough. It must be rebuilt. And she was no longer the same. Neither was he. The following days were filled with reflection, as if she were walking within herself, feeling memories, wounds, and hopes that still trembled like candles in the wind. She painted less, wrote more, spent hours on the building's terrace, watching the sky over the small town, trying to understand where she had lost herself. And it was in that interval, that suspension of time, that Bernardo returned, not with flowers, nor declarations, but with a proposal, a gesture, a plea disguised as hope. They met again at the corner cafe, he with lowered eyes, she with loose hair and an oversized coat. They drank coffee in silence, until he said, without preamble, "I want to come back to you, but I don't want to come back against her." Beatriz frowned, not understanding. Bernardo took a deep breath and continued, "I want to try to do this right. I want us to have peace. I don't want to carry my mother as an enemy. I don't want to spend my life dividing love between guilt and revolt. But only you have the strength to change that. Only you can make her understand that. She hasn't lost a son. She might have gained a daughter." Beatriz remained silent for long seconds, her chest tight, her mind in conflict. How to ask that of someone who had been humiliated, sabotaged, hurt? How to extend a hand to someone who had pushed her away so many times? But Bernardo wasn't asking for Clarice. He was asking for them, for the chance at a love that no longer needed to hide from anyone. She looked into his eyes, and there was sincerity. A lost boy trying to become a man, a son trying not to abandon his mother, and, above all, someone willing to change. "I can try," she said softly. "Not for her, but for me. Because if we want a new beginning, it can't be born from the same anger that almost destroyed us." Bernardo nodded, relieved, emotional. He extended his hand over the table. She took it, and in that gesture, they made an invisible pact to try to build a bridge where there were only ruins. Days later, it was she who called Clarice. The mother-in-law's voice on the phone was cold, surprised. Beatriz spoke calmly, firmly, and with a gentleness that only those who know pain can offer. She said she would like to see her, not to argue, nor to settle scores, but to talk, woman to woman, soul to soul. Clarice hesitated, but accepted. The night before the meeting, Beatriz didn't sleep. She rehearsed 1,000 phrases, cried in the shower, remembered every look that made her want to give up. But she decided to go anyway, because to love is also to forgive, and to forgive is not to forget. It's to choose to move forward with dignity, intact. That's what she wanted, not revenge, but healing. In the mirror, before leaving, she saw a version of herself she had never known. Strong, whole, mature. Not the girl who cried hidden in the studio, but the woman who, even wounded, chose peace. And as she walked to the house that once wanted her gone, now it was she who knocked on the door, but not to ask for entry, rather to say, "I exist, and I will no longer erase myself." The reunion brought no resolution, no promises. It brought silence, but a new silence, lighter, less suffocating. Beatriz returned home with a confused heart, her face still damp, and the sense that the man who once loved her now finally saw her. But what to do with that gaze? What to do with everything that still hurt, even after an apology? Love isn't a reset button. Wanting to return isn't enough. You have to rebuild. And she was no longer the same. Neither was he. The following days were filled with reflection, as if she were walking inside herself, feeling through memories, wounds, and hopes that still flickered like candles in the wind. She painted less, wrote more, spent hours on the rooftop, watching the sky of the small town, trying to understand where she had lost herself. And it was in that pause, that suspension of time, that Bernardo returned, not with flowers or declarations, but with a proposal, a gesture, a plea disguised as hope. They met again at the corner cafe. He, with lowered eyes, she, with loose hair and a coat too big for her. They drank coffee in silence, until he said plainly, "I want to come back to you, but not against her." Beatriz frowned, confused. Bernardo took a deep breath and continued, "I want to do this right. I want us to have peace. I don't want to carry my mother as an enemy. I don't want to live a life where love is split between guilt and rebellion. But only you have the strength to change that. Only you can help her understand that. She hasn't lost a son. She might have gained a daughter." Beatriz stayed silent for a long moment. Her chest tightened, her mind conflicted. How can you ask that of someone who was humiliated, sabotaged, hurt? How can you extend your hand to someone who pushed you so many times? But Bernardo wasn't asking for Clarice. He was asking for them, for a chance at love that no longer had to hide. She looked into his eyes, and there was honesty. A lost boy trying to become a man, a son trying not to abandon his mother, and above all, someone willing to change. "I can try," she said softly. "Not for her, for me. Because if we want a new beginning, it can't be born from the same anger that almost destroyed us." Bernardo nodded, relieved, emotional. He reached across the table. She took his hand. And in that gesture, they sealed an invisible pact, to try to build a bridge where only ruins remained. Days later, it was Beatriz who called Clarice. Her mother-in-law's voice was cold, surprised. Beatriz spoke calmly, firmly, and with a kindness that only those who've known pain can offer. She said she'd like to meet, not to argue, not to settle scores, but to talk, woman to woman, soul to soul. Clarice hesitated, but accepted. The night before the meeting, Beatriz didn't sleep. She rehearsed 1,000 sentences, cried in the shower, remembered every look that made her want to give up. But she decided to go anyway, because to love is also to forgive, and to forgive is not to forget, but to choose to move forward with dignity and tact. That's what she wanted, not revenge, but healing. In the mirror, before leaving, she saw a version of herself she'd never known. Strong, whole, mature. Not the girl who used to cry in her studio, but the woman who, even wounded, chose peace. And as she walked to the house that once wanted her gone, now it was her knocking at the door, but not to ask to be let in. She came to say, "I exist, and I won't erase myself ever again." The mansion felt larger that morning, maybe because Beatriz felt smaller in the face of the past etched into its walls, furniture, and marble steps she already knew well, but never truly mastered. It was her third time setting foot there, but this time Bernardo wasn't by her side. No dinner, no masked courtesy test, no exchanged glances in silence. It was just her, whole, alone, and yet stronger than ever. Clarice met her at the door in a light gray robe, her eyes slightly swollen. She wore no makeup, no smile. Her face was that of someone who hadn't slept in days, or of someone who had finally realized that the war she waged was with herself. There was no kiss on the cheek, no pleasantries, just a hand gesture toward the living room, as if to say, "Enter, if you wish." Beatrice walked slowly, the cold marble underfoot, her steps echoing in the vast empty space. She sat on the same sofa where she had once been tested, examined, judged. Clarice sat across from her, holding a teacup. The tea was already served, steam rising like a whisper between them. There was something solemn in that silence, as if they were about to seal something ancient, as if history at last called for a truce. Beatrice spoke first. "I didn't come here to ask for your approval, or to confront you. I came because I love your son, but more than that, I came because I'm tired of fighting a woman who, deep down, is also fighting alone." Clarice didn't respond. She just looked at her, but her eyes weren't sharp anymore. They were dull, as if some inner wall had begun to crumble. "I know what you did. I know about the sabotage, the missing invitations, the planted words, even the man you sent to seduce me. I know, but I'm not here to demand anything. I came because I want peace. Because if one day Bernardo and I build a family, I want you to be part of it. Not because I need your blessing, but because he needs your presence, and because maybe I do too." The last sentence escaped like a breath, a confession with no pride. Clarice moved for the first time, set the teacup down, then spoke, in a low, cracked voice, sounding older. "You remind me of myself. Before everything. Before the arranged marriages, the appearances, the political alliances. I also loved someone who wasn't good enough. My father drove him away. I married who they told me to. I did what was expected, and I survived. But I never forgave the love I lost. And when I saw you, I saw the threat I never dared to be." Beatrice shivered. It was like seeing the root of the hatred, the center of the rejection, the wound that shaped an entire life. "And what did you gain from it all?" she asked gently. Clarice smiled, a sad smile. Her eyes welled up as she answered, "Control, and an emptiness where love should have been." The silence returned, but now it was different. A silence full of bridges being rebuilt. Clarice stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled down an old wooden box. Inside were letters, photographs. One showed Clarice very young, holding hands with a simple man in a park. That was my good enough. I left him. My father applauded, and I was never whole again. Beatriz held the photo, felt a lump in her throat. There, in that faded memory, was the root of it all. The pain that spilled over into the next generations. I'm not your rival, Clarice. I never was. But maybe I can be the continuation of your story, not as a repetition, but as a new beginning. Clarice sat again, looked at Beatriz as if seeing a daughter she never knew she had. And for the first time, her voice came out fragile. Would you forgive a woman like me? Beatriz didn't answer with words. She simply reached out across the table. Clarice hesitated, then touched her hand, and that touch said more than any speech. The tea grew cold. Time felt suspended, but in that gesture something dissolved. The hurt, the distance, the fear. Two women who once clashed, now understood each other, not as equals, but as survivors of the same invisible war. And when Beatrice left the house that morning, the sky was clear, for the first time, because that final tea wasn't a farewell. It was a beginning, the start of an ending no one expected, not even Clarice. Some goodbyes don't need words, and some reconciliations, as unlikely as they seem, only happen when silence is pierced by a gesture too powerful to ignore. Beatrice left the mansion that morning with a tight heart, but something inside her said that the wound between the two women had finally begun to heal. And like everything she felt, like everything she never knew how to say aloud, Beatrice decided to express it through what she knew best: art. For weeks, she locked herself in her modest studio, dug through old files, sifted through images buried in folders, newspapers, and biographies of Bernardo's family. And then she found what she was looking for: an old, nearly faded photo that everyone else had overlooked, except her. It was Clarice, very young, before the arranged marriage. Her hair loose, her face serene, and in her arms, a small boy, big, curious eyes, wearing a wool coat. Bernardo, maybe 2 years old. In the image, Clarice wasn't the cold and calculating woman everyone knew. She was simply a young mother, holding her son with a love that didn't need polish. Beatrice stared at that image for hours, as if she could hear a silent scream echoing from it. And then she knew what she had to do. Not to prove anything, not to please, but to give Clarice back what pain had taken from her: memory. The painting took weeks to finish. Beatrice used soft tones, delicate strokes, almost reverent. She recreated the image faithfully, but added what the photo didn't show. In the background, instead of a plain scene, she painted an open, blooming garden. As if saying without saying, you can still bloom. You can still be a mother, not just by blood, but by soul. In silence, she wrapped the canvas in brown paper and tied it with an olive green ribbon. She wrote a small note, her handwriting trembling. Not every past has to hurt forever. With respect, Beatrice. She didn't deliver it herself. She asked Bernardo to take it, said she didn't expect anything. No reply, no gesture, no return. She just wanted Clarice to see it, to understand that maybe, for the first time in years, someone had seen her pain without judging it. Clarice received the gift in the late afternoon, as the sun poured golden light across the veranda. She was sitting alone, flipping through an old book, when Bernardo arrived with the package. He didn't say anything, just handed it to her. Clarice looked at it with suspicion, but something in her son's face stopped her from refusing. When she opened the package, her hands faltered. And when she saw the painting, everything crumbled. That forgotten image, resurrected with such care. That brushstroke capturing a part of her even she had forgotten existed. It wasn't just a painting. It was a key, a bridge, a painted embrace. And there, in front of the canvas, Clarice cried for the first time in years. The tears fell slowly. They weren't tears of guilt, nor of shame. They were of relief. As if, finally, someone had touched what remained human inside her fortress. She ran her fingers over the dried paint, smiled, and whispered, "She saw me, truly, like no one ever has." That night, Clarice didn't sleep. She stared at the painting until the sky turned dark, and as silence wrapped the house, she understood what Bernardo felt for Beatrice. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't fleeting passion, it was connection, it was healing. And maybe, for the first time, Clarice truly wished to be part of it. not as a figure of control, but as a woman, as a mother, as someone who could still learn to love differently. Love without fear, without control, without competition. The hall was decorated with simplicity. The flowers weren't exotic. The arrangements didn't come from fancy ateliers, and Beatriz's dress wasn't designed by any famous stylist. But there was light, a light that didn't come from chandeliers, but from smiles, from teary eyes, from the genuine presence of the right people. The wedding would take place there, among friends, family, and all those who believed that love, even when torn, could be stitched back together. But a suspended silence lingered in the air, like a note still waiting to be played, because everyone knew someone was missing from the room. Clarice. Beatriz was serene, though her heart raced. She knew Clarice had received the invitation, and she also knew that if she came, it wouldn't be out of duty. It would be a choice, a difficult one, a choice only made by those willing to let go of pride. The ceremony began. Bernardo stood at the altar, eyes fixed on the woman approaching with slow, steady steps. Beatriz walked like someone who had won wars, not one, but many. Every step echoed the humiliations she had swallowed in silence, the nights she had wanted to give up, the paintings made with tears, the screams buried in silence. She walked with dignity, with love, with forgiveness. And then, just as the officiant began his words, the doors opened. Everyone turned. Time seemed to stop. Clarice. She wore a modest navy blue outfit, and in her hands, the painting. Yes, that painting. The one Beatriz had painted. She held it like a relic, her eyes misty, her face bare, her steps unsure. But she was there, in body, in soul, in humility. Bernardo saw her and swallowed back tears. Beatriz closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Clarice walked slowly, reached the altar, handed the painting to her heart's daughter, and then, for the first time, spoke with a trembling voice. "I spent my life trying to keep my son close, afraid of losing him. But today, I understood that, in trying to control him, I almost lost the most beautiful thing he could give me. You." Silence. Sacred silence. Then, applause. Not out of formality, but emotion. Clarice embraced Beatriz, not as someone giving in, but as someone letting go. A long, warm, sincere embrace. There, in front of everyone, the woman who had tried so hard to push her away, now received her. Not as a daughter-in-law, not as a rival. As a daughter. The ceremony continued. The officiant's words now carried new weight, new light. The yes wasn't just between two lovers. It was a yes across generations, across worlds, across reconciled pain. When they kissed, it wasn't just a kiss of passion. It was one of triumph, of reconciliation, of real love. One that had survived doubt, sabotage, pride, and rejection. At the party, Clarice danced with Bernardo, then with Beatriz. She smiled, not with euphoria, but with peace. The peace of someone who, after so long at war with her own ghosts, could finally lower her arms. And that night, as guests toasted, danced, and celebrated, Beatriz looked at the sky. There were stars, so many, as if the universe whispered softly, "You won." And she truly had. Not for marrying the man she loved, but for keeping her soul whole, for refusing to harden, for forgiving without being asked, for loving without limits, and for turning pain into art, silence into gesture, and rejection into family. Not daughter-in-law, not rival, daughter. And so ends a love story that didn't want to be just a romance, but redemption.